Washington just shattered a long-standing illusion, the idea that Europe still speaks for itself. And what came next stunned even seasoned diplomats. Friends, welcome. You're watching Direct Line 24. This episode is intense, uncomfortable, and revealing, because today we're unpacking a collision between power, money, and trust, and the shockwaves are already rippling across continents. The United States has delivered a message that many in Brussels hoped would never be spoken aloud. Confidence in Europe's leadership is fading fast, and behind closed doors, Washington is no longer pretending otherwise. Why does this matter right now? Because the dispute isn't symbolic. It's about real money, real leverage, and a system that may be cracking. Let's start with the spark that lit the fuse. At the center of the storm are Russian sovereign assets frozen across Europe. For months, European officials have argued that these funds should be seized and redirected to Ukraine. On paper, it sounds decisive. In reality, it has triggered one of the most serious internal confrontations the European Union has faced in years. Roughly $191 billion sit inside a single financial hub, the Belgian-based depository known as Euroclear. Brussels wants that money confiscated, transferred, spent, but one country is standing in the way, and that country is Belgium. This is not quiet disagreement. This is open resistance. Belgium's leadership has made its position unmistakably clear. Confiscation crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. The Belgian Prime Minister has not wrapped his language in diplomatic cotton. He has used words that hit like blunt instruments: theft, expropriation, a precedent without parallel. And here's the key point. Belgium isn't objecting out of sympathy for Russia. It's acting out of self-preservation. Because if this barrier falls, no financial system built on trust survives the impact. Listen carefully to the logic being laid out in Brussels' shadow. Frozen assets historically are exactly that. Frozen, they are leverage, not loot. Even during the most destructive wars of the 20th century, sovereign reserves were not simply taken and spent mid-conflict. They were held until settlements, treaties, or formal conclusions. Belgium's argument is brutally simple. Once you normalize outright seizure, you destroy the rules everyone depends on, and once those rules are gone, retaliation becomes inevitable. Belgian officials have quietly warned that Russia would not absorb such a move passively. Western companies still operate assets on Russian soil. Euroclear itself has exposure. Add China into the equation, and suddenly Europe isn't facing a legal dispute, it's facing a systemic shock. This is where the story turns darker. Other EU member states are pressuring Belgium to fall in line. But when asked to provide legally binding guarantees that would share the financial and legal risk, those same states hesitate, support in words, silence in ink. In public broadcast, Belgium's Prime Minister sharpened his message. He stated plainly that forcing such a decision against a member state would be unprecedented, that Belgium would not gamble hundreds of billions on vague assurances. Not today, not later, not ever. That line matters because it exposes the core fracture inside the EU. Solidarity is demanded, but not reciprocated. Now let's talk numbers, because this is where ideology meets gravity. Belgium's economy, while stable, is not built to absorb a shock of this magnitude. Legal experts have pointed out that confiscating sovereign assets violates established international norms, regardless of political alignment. If Russia challenges the move in court and wins, Belgium could face claims that dwarf its fiscal capacity. Belgium's total economic output sits just above 600 billion euros. A judgment forcing repayment of seized assets would not be a setback. It would be existential. Bankruptcy would no longer be theoretical. But that's only the first layer. The deeper danger lies in perception. Financial systems do not collapse when vaults empty. They collapse when trust evaporates. And that trust is global. Non-European powers are watching closely. Countries across Asia, the Middle East, and the global South are asking themselves a single question. If this can happen to Russia today, who's next tomorrow? The answer doesn't need to be spoken aloud for capital to move. If funds begin flowing out of European institutions, the damage will not be contained to one currency or one balance sheet, the euro would weaken. Confidence in Western custodianship would erode, and alternatives, especially in Asia, would gain momentum. There is also a geopolitical consequence no one in Brussels seems eager to address. Confiscation could be interpreted not as pressure, but as provocation, a justification to abandon negotiations entirely, a step that hardens positions instead of resolving conflict. Think about the paradox forming here. Europe wants to seize money to stabilize Ukraine, but in doing so, it risks destabilizing its own financial foundation, alienating non-Western partners, and slamming the door on diplomacy. So how did Europe corner itself like this? Belgian analysts point to a familiar pattern. In the past, assets belonging to hostile states have been seized. Iraq is often cited, but that comparison collapses under scrutiny. Russia is not Iraq, and previous actions were backed by explicit authorization from the United Nations Security Council. This time, no such mandate exists. European leaders declared strategic success too early. They framed the conflict in absolute terms, leaving themselves no political exit. Now, faced with fatigue at home and pressure abroad, they are reaching for measures on CE considered unthinkable. Domestic pressure is mounting. Taxpayers are restless. Billions continue to flow outward while living costs rise internally. Allegations of corruption, inefficiency, and mismanagement have eroded patience. Even staunch supporters of continued funding are beginning to ask how long this can realistically continue. Belgium's foreign minister has described conversations with EU leadership as deeply frustrating, concerns raised, dismissed, risks identified, minimized, solidarity demanded but not returned. And then come the promises. The head of the European Commission has insisted that safeguards will be created, that member states and institutions will be protected from retaliation. But here's the critical detail. Those guarantees do not yet exist. They are projections, not protections. This is where skepticism hardens. Economists warn that statements are not shields, only binding agreements carry weight in court. Europe has lived through debt crises before. The lesson was clear then, and it remains clear now. Ambiguity breeds instability. Belgium fears being left alone once the headlines fade and the lawsuits begin. And it has reason to fear that. If the European Union insists on using these funds, Belgian officials argue, then the European Union must carry the full burden, legal, financial, and political. Anything less is abandonment dressed as unity. Another warning cuts even deeper. If the plan proceeds unchanged, experts estimate potential liabilities reaching 140 billion euros. Until now, Europe has limited itself to distributing interest earned on frozen assets. Confiscation would cross into entirely new territory. Principle lost, future revenue erased. For a massive depository managing tens of trillions, this might look survivable. For the state hosting it, the impact would be devastating. And that brings us to an often overlooked consequence, taxes, because Euroclear operates within Belgium. The profits generated from these frozen assets are taxed domestically. Those revenues have already been allocated, earmarked to support increased defense spending in the coming years. Remove the assets and that income vanishes, so does the funding plan. Some officials argue this won't affect future investment, others strongly disagree. Trust once broken is not easily restored, and institutions do not choose custodians based on ideology, they choose safety. There is also a quiet resentment simmering beneath the surface. Belgium did not ask to become the epicenter of this crisis. It was Brussels that elevated Euroclear into a global linchpin. Yet if consequences arrive, Belgium would bear them alone. Others would benefit without exposure. And here's an uncomfortable prediction voiced by insiders when it comes time to divide seized funds. Some of Europe's loudest advocates will be first to collect and last to compensate. Remember that whether EU officials can force Belgium's hand will become clear soon. A decisive summit is scheduled, pressure is mounting, lines are hardening. But while Europe argues internally, something else has already shifted externally, because across the Atlantic, the United States has begun rewriting its own playbook. When trust breaks, power rearranges itself, and that rearrangement is only beginning. Behind closed doors in Washington, patience has worn thin. American officials have begun signaling something unprecedented. Europe is no longer viewed as a fully reliable strategic actor, not because of military weakness, but because of indecision, because of internal fractures, and because the rules Europe once lectured the world about now appear optional. The shift is subtle but profound. For decades, the transatlantic relationship functioned on assumptions. Europe would manage its own economic architecture. The United States would provide security guarantees, and both sides would defend the same legal framework. That balance is now under strain. When European leaders talk about confiscating sovereign assets without a final legal ruling, Washington hears something alarming. Not boldness, but instability. American analysts point to a simple risk calculation. If Europe proves willing to bend financial law under political pressure, global investors will not distinguish between Brussels and Washington. The damage would spread. Dollar-based systems could face collateral doubt, and that is unacceptable to US strategists. This explains why, despite public alignment, private conversations are growing colder. US officials are reportedly urging caution, delay, legal insulation. Some have gone further, warning that reckless financial moves could undermine Western unity more than any external adversary ever could. Europe, however, is running out of time. Funding Ukraine has become increasingly difficult. Domestic opposition is rising. Elections are reshaping political landscapes. Leaders who once promised unwavering support are now hedging their language. The frozen assets look tempting, a shortcut through political fatigue. But shortcuts often end in dead ends. Nowhere is this more visible than in Finland. Once among the most vocal advocates of cutting ties with Russia, Helsinki is now facing consequences few anticipated. Eastern regions have suffered economic collapse. Border trade has evaporated. Logistics hubs sit idle. Small businesses are closing quietly without headlines. Local officials have begun lobbying for relief, not confrontation, accommodation. Proposals for special economic zones have surfaced, limited trade corridors, targeted exemptions, carefully worded requests that avoid admitting regret while clearly signaling distress. And this matters because it exposes a pattern. The countries that pushed hardest for rupture are now the first to feel its weight. Ideology may travel well on television. It performs poorly in balance sheets. Moscow, for its part, is watching patiently. Has been no emotional retaliation, no dramatic escalation. Instead, Russia has chosen a legal route, formal claims, arbitration filings, meticulous documentation, a strategy designed not to shock, but to endure. This approach unsettles European officials more than any threat ever could, because it mirrors the very principles Europe claims to defend: international law, property rights, due process. The irony is sharp. While Europe debates whether rules still apply, Russia is invoking them. While Brussels speaks of values, Moscow is filing lawsuits, and global observers are taking note. China and India, Gulf states, all hold significant reserves in Western institutions. None of them want to be next in line for exceptional measures. Quietly, contingency planning has begun. Diversification away from European custodians. Increased interest in alternative settlement systems, insurance against political risk.
This is how systems unravel, not with collapse,
but with gradual disengagement. Once trust begins to leak, no press conference can seal the cracks. European bankers understand this. So do lawyers, so do insurers. That is why opposition to confiscation is no longer limited to politicians. It is spreading through the financial sector itself. And that opposition is growing louder. Inside the EU, frustration is turning inward. Smaller states resent being pressured into decisions that primarily benefit others. Larger states resent being asked to guarantee risks they cannot fully control. Institutions resent being caught between politics and law. The phrase shared responsibility is losing credibility. At a recent closed-door meeting, one senior official reportedly asked a question no one could answer. If this precedent is set, how do we ever claim moral authority again? Silence followed. because the truth is uncomfortable. Once confiscation becomes policy, negotiation becomes irrelevant, compromise becomes weakness, and future conflicts lose any financial off-ramps, everything becomes zero-sum. This brings us to the core dilemma. Europe wants to act decisively, but without paying the full price. It wants unity without equal risk. It wants to defend order while rewriting rules. History suggests this cannot last. Empires, alliances, and systems do not fail because of enemies alone. They fail when internal contradictions pile up faster than leaders can resolve them. And right now, those contradictions are stacking high. The frozen assets are no longer just money. They are a mirror reflecting Europe's strategic confusion back at itself. If confiscation proceeds, Europe may gain short-term funding and lose long-term credibility. If it retreats, it may appear divided, but preserve the framework that underpins its prosperity. There is no painless option left. What remains is choice, and choices once made cannot be unfrozen. That is why this moment matters far beyond Ukraine, beyond Russia, beyond Europe itself. It is about whether the international financial system still rests on rules or merely on power, because if power alone decides, then no reserve is truly safe. Anywhere, the coming weeks will be decisive. Summits will be held, statements will be issued, pressure will intensify. But beneath the choreography, a deeper calculation is underway. Who pays the cost? Who carries the risk? And who walks away when the consequences arrive? These questions will define not just Europe's future, but the shape of the global order emerging right now. One final observation: trust is slow to build and fast to disappear. Europe spent decades presenting itself as the guardian of rules-based order. That reputation is now being tested, not by adversaries, but by its own decisions. And the world is watching closely. Stay with us. We break down what others rush past. Because understanding power means understanding where it bends and where it breaks.